Hello, today I'm just going to be covering over some of the portions of the brain. This is going to be a very broad and quick overview. So in case you're in a Psychology 101 course or you just want to learn this information for whatever reason, this video is for you. As well, it's important to know that the brain is very complicated and it's not one part controls one thing. So some of the parts overlap, but we'll get into that later. So enjoy. Alright, so the first portion of the brain we're going to be looking at is called the cerebral cortex, also called the cerebrum. So in our evolutionary history, this was the last part to develop. And when you look at a brain, just in a picture or whatever, this is probably what you're going to be seeing. It's kind of the wrinkly outer shell of the brain. From here, it breaks down even further into different lobes and areas, but for an introductory knowledge, this is probably what you're going to need to know. Just the four sections. So these comprise the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So the first section we're going to look at are the frontal lobes, and you can remember their placement very easily by being at the front. Language, memory, and judgment are all controlled by the frontal lobes, and you can think of it as external stimuli comes in through the front, and that goes to the frontal lobes. Next, the parietal lobes. The way that I remember these are that parents or parietal figures sometimes pat their kids on their head. This is exactly where the parietal lobes are, and then the touch and the visual information of the parent are both conveyed to the motor cortex. Next is the temporal lobe. This is easy to remember as it is near the temples of your skull, also the ears. The temporal lobe processes auditory information and language comprehension. Again, these two topics can easily be associated with the ears, and it's where it's located. Next is the occipital lobe. So the way that I remember this is the phrase eyes in the back of your head. And the occipital lobe processes visual information, so it's pretty easy to remember this one just because ocular and oculus all kind of relate to eyes. So again, this one and temporal lobe are both pretty easy to remember. Now moving to the most primitive portion of the brain stem is comprised of the midbrain, the pons, the medulla, and also kind of the spinal cord. So the first portion of the brain stem we're going to be looking at is the midbrain. So this one's pretty easy to remember just because obviously it's in the middle of the brain. And it's also sort of in between the eyes and the ears, so you can remember what it does as it tracks visual stimulation and reflexes triggered by sound. Next is the pons, and if you know anything about chess, you know that the pons are in the middle, so you can remember that the pons is in between the medulla and the midbrain. And the pons just conveys information between the cerebellum and the cortex, and also provides equilibrium, so you can just kind of remember the chess reference. Alright, so the next portion we're going to be looking at is the spinal cord, and the spinal cord, although not a part of the brain, it still conveys information between the brain and the rest of the body, so I thought I'd show you how it links up there. Next, the medulla. It is at the very base, and it regulates basic and primitive things such as regulating your heart rate, your breathing, and your swallowing. So the way that you can remember this is that it's obviously at the base, so it has to do very simple things. As well, Medusa, the character, the snake-headed woman, she would turn you into stone, stopping your breathing and your heart rate, so that's how I remembered it. So the next portion we'll be looking at is the limbic system. This developed in between the cerebrum and the brainstem, so it is a little bit less complex than the cerebrum, but more complex than the brainstem. So the hippocampus is in charge of spatial memory and reasoning and all that sort of stuff, and the way that you can remember this is through the second word campus. Campus is an area on a university or college which you may be attending, so it's easy to remember that it's kind of spatial location and all that. Next is the amygdala. So the amygdala is a little portion off of the hippocampus, and the way that you can remember this is the low beginning bit, Amy. So the way that I remember this is Amy is very emotional, and where does she live? She lives on the campus. The amygdala regulates basic emotions and is part of the hippocampus, so you can kind of connect those two. Alright, so next we have the thalamus, which is sort of in the center of the brain, and it conveys sensory information all around the cortex. So the way that I remember the thalamus is that it is, again, in the middle, so it has access to the entire cortex. It's not off to one side or it's not at the very bottom, so it kind of has access to the entire brain to convey its information. Next, the hypothalamus oversees the endocrine and the autonomic nervous system. So hypo means less or under, and hyper means over or more. So the hypothalamus, I think of it as controlling everything under the thalamus. So the thalamus controls the brain, where the hypothalamus controls everything under the brain through the autonomic and endocrine systems. Lastly is the olfactory bulb. It's just a small little section, sort of kind of near the nose, and the way that you can remember this is that it controls smell, and it's near the nose. Alright, so just covering over a few other portions of the brain. First is the cerebellum, not to be confused with cerebrum. The cerebellum is a very basic portion of the brain. You can see it, a red arrow is pointing to it, and it's a little cross-hatched bit. It is a portion of the brain stem, and in conjunction with those, it is also called the hindbrain. The cerebellum controls balance and coordination, and the way that you can remember this is the phrase bell of the ball. So the cerebellum controls balance, ball. So bell of the ball. Next is Broca's area. So this is near the temple on the left side, generally. It's kind of near the ears, and it is for speech production. There are two hemispheres of the brain, the left and the right. And what connects these is a band of fibers called the corpus callosum. And the way that you can remember this is callosum, it brings the sums together. Alright, so that's the end of portions of the brain. So if you'd like a different topic covered, please let me know in the comments. And if you have any memorizing techniques for portions of the brain, also leave those in the comments. So with that, good luck on your classes and have a great day. Bye.